everyone. Thanks for coming along to my talk about theming Drupal in 2017. I'm just going to get right into it. So first off, yes, I'm Laura. I'm a designer and developer working for X Equals, a digital agency in Wellington. And thanks for having me along to talk today. So a little bit of background on me. Growing up, I always thought that I was going to be a print designer. My high school didn't really have any computer classes. It was an all-girls school. The year 13 computing course consisted mainly of learning how to use Excel. But regardless, in high school, I really loved the web and customizing my online profile pages like MySpace and Neopets. Just teaching myself by Googling and copying other people's code. So yeah, I was really obsessed with the web, even though my house didn't get broadband internet until I went away to university. So I went to design school in Wellington. After I graduated, I did some freelance work, mainly doing branding and making WordPress sites, just teaching myself because that's what clients wanted. And for the last 3 years, I've been with X Equals doing design, development, site building, you name it. But I'm not bummed out that I went to design school, because I think it's given me a lot of skills that I use every day, like critical design thinking. And it means I'm quite good at the design to development process, if I do say so myself. So I kind of moved from designing posters and books to designing front-end systems and site architecture. But to me, the thinking is quite similar. So when I first started working at X Equals and working with Drupal, a lot of the work that I was doing was being handed old existing websites and being asked to make changes, and the code base would just be a hot mess. My inner designer kicks in and wants to organize the information, to segment it, give it some hierarchy, and just make some sense of it. Fair warning, there are some GIFs with swears coming up, pretty graphic. So there's layers and layers and layers and layers of CSS, all stacked one on top of the other, done by different developers over different years with different styles, different ways of commenting or not commenting their code. And you try to change one thing and suddenly your entire site collapses. And I just kept thinking to myself, I would never let a site that I build get this bad. So I'm going to talk about some of the tools that I'm using to try to do that while making the design to development process better than I think it's ever been. So these new tools. Some people get really excited and think, oh man, look at all those cool layouts and animations and fancy, freaky stuff that we can do. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but can it make your front end smaller? Can it make it more maintainable? Because I'm a big nerd and that's what I think is really cool. Because the thing is, people say CSS is easy. How many front-end developers do we have in the room? Yay, cool. So this hopefully will resonate with you. This is a quote from Jeremy Keith, who's just a front-end dev and blogger. Unlike a programming language that requires knowledge of loops, variables, and other concepts, CSS is pretty easy to pick up. Maybe it's because of this it has gained the reputation of being simple. It is simple in the sense of not complex, but that doesn't mean it's easy, because mistaking simple for easy will only lead to heartache. At the end of the day, I want someone to be able to look at a site that I did the front end for, no matter how many years ago, and be able to figure out what I was doing. And so, yeah, I'm trying to do that. So today I'm going to talk about Flexbox Grids and my general approach to front end, which is less is more. So Flexbox. Who's using Flexbox in their sites in production today? Hooray! So a little bit of preaching to the converted. Maybe I can teach you something you don't know. So it's a new display property value like block, inline block, table, etc. The basic concept of it is that once you give a container element the display value of Flex. It makes all its direct children Flex items, and they become really easy to lay out in ways that regular CSS hasn't been able to before. You no longer really need to use floats, width counts, negative margins, all this hacky stuff, because the way we're laying out the web is changing, and that's a really good thing. Because designers have already been building sites like this in their minds for a really long time. This is a screenshot from Adobe InDesign. Illustrator also has this functionality. And you can see all the basic principles of Flexbox. You've got the align objects in the top row, you can distribute them, you can create spacing between them. So Flexbox really just brings CSS in line to what designers are already doing. And the best thing about Flexbox right now is how well it's supported. And so yeah, we're using it in production now with really careful use of auto prefixes and testing. Oh. So yeah, now it's got a global support rate of 97%. And really the only stuff that doesn't support it is IE9. So yeah, every other browser has been supporting it for a while now. So you just really need to know a few things to get started, if I can find my mouse. So these are all things that you apply to the Flex container. That is the thing you set to display as Flex. So you've got your Flex direction, which sets which order you want your items to sit in. You can note that it doesn't have to be from left to right. You've got opposite, and you can set it in a column from top to bottom or bottom to top. Then you've got your Flex wrap, which basically tells the box whether it wants the items to try to all fit in one row, or whether once it runs out of room, it'll start a new row. You've got your horizontal distribution, where things sit left to right, and you've got these great new keywords for space between and space around, which means you don't have to use margins as much. And then you've got pretty much the same thing but vertically, and you've got that magical little vertical centering that you can do without any hacks. Whoop whoop, very cool. And another cool thing to note is that the default value for this property is stretch, so all of your items are going to be the same height. So no more JavaScript hacks to make them all the same height. Very cool. And then you've got your properties that you apply to the items inside the container to tell them how big you want them to be. And I think this is just easiest to show with an example. So I've got a little code pen. So I've got a Flex container with 3 items in it. I've just set it to equally have space between the objects, to vertically align them, and at the moment they've all got a Flex value of 0, 0, 300 pixels. So the first value is grow, by how much they should grow. The second value is shrink, and then the third value is the Flex basis. You can pretty much use this instead of giving things absolute widths. So FlexGrow works by taking up all of the remaining space and dividing it into fractions. So if we give the last item a Flex grow value of 1, even though it's got a Flex basis of 300 pixels, because I've said it should grow to a factor of 1, after all of the other boxes have taken up width, it's going to grow to fill the entire space. So if I uncomment the one for the first one, out of all of the remaining space, the first item is going to get 2/3 of the remaining space, and the last item is going to get 1/3 of the remaining space. And that's kind of the easiest way that I can explain FlexGrow. It's taken me a really long time to wrap my head around. So once you understand these pretty basic properties, you can suddenly set up really complex layouts with minimal code. Oh, and so you can see that if I comment out this, they're all going to be the same height, because that's that default value. Oh, Flexbox in production. So what makes Flexbox so great for Drupal is that it's really good for lists. And what's one of the most common ways that you show content in Drupal is a view. which is just a big list. The DOM for views are really perfect for Flexbox because you've got your views container becomes your Flex container, and each row item is a Flex item. A site that I worked on this year was the election website policy. It was the passion project of two lawyers and a designer working nights and weekends to get it up and running before the New Zealand election on September 23rd. The designer's actually here with us. Hi, Rachel. But the front-end time frame, because everyone was working out of their own spare time, the product owners, it meant that there was a really, really short timeline, and I was actually getting designs brought to me the week before the launch. So it was a really good opportunity to use Flexbox and just save myself some time. So this is the site, and each political policy is a node, and there's a taxonomy for political party and a taxonomy for topic, and then it's just grouped by topic and then by party. So each of these rows is a, oh, this is harder to see. No, you will. So yeah, you can see that this group is a Flex container, and I've just set the items to be aligned to the start of the Flex container and to wrap when they run out of room, which you can see that they're doing. And one cool tool that is making using Flexbox in production even easier is auto prefixes. So you can see here that it's got all of the WebKit and the MS values already in there, even though all the code that I wrote was the plain vanilla flex wrap, justify content, and display. Because most of the trouble in using Flexbox these days is around the known instabilities, by using an auto prefixer, you pretty much solve those problems before you even see them. And so that is just a thing that you can plug into whatever compiler you're using. There's lots of different flavors for Gulp and Compass and whatever you want. So yeah, after we built the entire site, there was only 2 places that I had to do manual fixes for, once for Safari and once for Internet Explorer. So I hope that's been a pretty good introduction, and if you're not using it in production, I hope you can convince all of your teammates to start using it in production. It's going to save you a lot of time. Next, grids. Who's heard of grids? Less hands. Cool. It's a new display value, just like Flexbox, but with a difference. It does have a lot of the same features as Flexbox, like vertical alignment, horizontal alignment, and wrapping, but that's really just where it starts. Grids are really powerful and really intuitive. It really helps to separate the content and the styles so they're not so dependent on each other. So you're not forced to change your content to fit a design. So you can keep a DOM structure that makes sense and then have crazy layouts that don't reflect that at all. And that sounds pretty cool to me. Because just like Flexbox, grids are bringing designers and developers closer together, because designers use grids a hell of a lot. I would know, as I went to design school and have a lot of designer friends. So this is a screenshot from an early design for the NatureSpace website. NatureSpace is a website funded by the Department of Conservation to support conservation groups in New Zealand, and they're all mainly volunteer groups. So earlier this year we worked on a site retheme. This was an early design, and I've turned my grid lines on in InDesign so you can see what's going on. And so this is a 12-column grid, and I would bet a fair amount of money that most of the web is built on a 12-column grid. So you can see where being able to replicate this in a browser is going to be really cool. So just like Flexbox, there are some basic properties you need to learn to get started. And these are the ones that you set for the grid container. And what I love about this, just by looking, is how self-explanatory they are. You can look at each of those rules and kind of figure out what they're going to do. Whereas with floats, like, what the fuck is a float? So the first rule is you set up your columns. And you just do that by giving a value to each column you want to create. And when you set it up, each grid item is automatically going to get placed in a column left to right if you don't set anything else. And you may be thinking, like, FR? What the hell is an FR? Did I not mention that Grids introduces a new unit of measurement? It does, but don't freak out, because it's really cool and useful. It's a flexible unit that works pretty much in the same way that FlexGrow and Shrink does. By that I mean it works with fractions of the available space. So after all of the other measurements on the page are added up, it's going to take the remaining space and allocate it to the FR units. So if we go back to this example, the second box, the first column is going to be 100 pixels, the second is going to be 50% of the entire width, and because there's only one other FR value, it's going to get the entire remaining space. And then rows work in pretty much the same way, just the other way around. And this is where Flexbox and Grids completely differentiate, because within one container, you can control exactly where each item sits in the grid, vertically and horizontally, irrespective of the DOM. They can be different sizes, they can start and stop in different places, and even overlap each other. You can also use the repeat notation to set up multiple columns and rows at once. Another thing to note is that by default, there are no gaps between the rows or columns, but they're really easy to declare. This is a shorthand for you can declare them separately, or you can just use grid gap to declare them both at once. And just like margins and padding, if you only declare one, it's going to do both of them. So you place grid items by telling them where they should start and stop on the grid, if you don't want them to just automatically be placed. And this is just easiest to show as an example. So Firefox has this very cool tool so you can see the grid lines. So I've set up 3 equal width columns, and I've set it to automatically generate rows at 100 pixels high for as many as it needs. So it's automatically placing the items that I've not set a location to, and it's just flowing it around the item where I've said specifically, this is where you're going to go. So even though the bigger div is near the bottom of the DOM, by telling it I want it to start at the first column and the first row, it's going to put it there. So when you make a grid, it creates these lines that separate the areas, and these are the numbers that you refer to place the items. So you've got the grid line 1 at the left, 2 in the middle here, 3 there, and 4 there. So if I tell it to finish at 4, it's going to make it take up the whole width and just automatically flow the rest of the items around it. So yeah, I really like that. But one of the other super exciting things about grids is the templating and grid area features. So yeah, grid areas are really, really cool. They're simple, they just make sense. In a way, you're kind of writing markup with words. So again, I'll just turn my grid lines on so you can see. So I've set up, again, a 3-column grid with 3 rows, and then I've given each of these areas names. And then, just by telling which element, which area it's going to go, it's going to place it all for me. That's literally the only markup that's there. I've just given them some colors so you can tell the difference. Like, how much more code would you have to write to get this done, like, traditionally? A hell of a lot more than that. And yeah, I just really like to emphasize that if I get rid of this, it's not going to move the rest of the items. And if I put it somewhere else, it's still going to go where it's meant to be. So yeah. But it's not super well supported right now, but it will be. Global support's already at 75%. Lucky us in New Zealand, that value goes up a little bit because we have less people using older versions of Internet Explorer. Yes. Yeah, so you can see all that red. So it's only really recently become supported as early as March this year. And there's a few known issues. Damn Safari. Safari's turning into the worst browser. Okay, so I've already mentioned the NatureSpace site, and while we built that earlier this year, so I couldn't use grids, obviously, I have taken a static copy of the front page so I can give you an example. So this is the live website. We've got this cool little SVG map. I was going to talk about this, but I ran out of time. Sorry, if you want to know more about it, ask me. So this is my local copy. And I've just redone this little banner section here. Sorry, it's just a little bit hard for me to see. Okay. Grids. I'm going to put some opacity on this. Sorry. Is that? I can't see. What have I written? Haha. Cool, so now you can see the grid lines. So it's 4 rows, 3 columns, but the first and last columns are really, really small. They're only 60 pixels. And I've done that so you don't have to use any margins or padding around this title field. So the banner I've just set to take up the whole area of the grid, and then the caption is sitting on top of it, sitting from the 4th to the 5th row line and from the 2nd to the 3rd column line. You'll notice it's not absolutely positioned or anything like that. Because it's second in the DOM, it's automatically being laid over on top of the banner. And so yeah, you can see how combining that with media queries means you've got a really responsive CSS. That's that. So, is this the end of floats? I wish it was. And it almost is, but not quite. Instead, what I think we can start doing is using floats for what they were actually designed for, which is for stuff like images within a block of text. So this brings me to my kind of conclusion. Yeah, less is more. You might cringe, but when I build a site, I write all of the CSS from scratch every single time. And I only write the CSS needed for that site. We are still doing some Drupal 7 sites, and we use Omega as our base theme. And for D8 sites, we use our own theme called Bones, which is based on Classy. There is a sandbox theme for it on Drupal.org if you want to download it and give it a go. And people still ask me, why don't you just use Bootstrap or another framework? Buzzword, buzzword, buzzword. And I really just want to look at them like this, and I want to throttle them. I'm more than happy for you to disagree with me, but I find that in many ways Bootstrap really works against the natural order of the web. There are so many resets and predefined styles, and for simple sites, you can sometimes end up writing more CSS just to get back to square one. In my opinion, writing CSS from scratch doesn't take any more time than using a framework when you understand the DOM. So work with the markup rather than against it, because HTML and CSS is a framework and it's pretty well supported. So I'm not saying never use a framework, just be selective about it. And be careful in scoping a project to choose one that fits your needs. So at the end of the day, you only write the CSS that you really need to. Because the average lifespan of a website is only becoming smaller, it makes sense to not make them bigger and more complicated than they need to be. Because do you dress for all weather all the time, bring a rain jacket on a sunny day? You might in Wellington, where I'm from, but you don't do it for a website. So I've already mentioned NatureSpace. For that site, we identified early on that a really high priority was for the site to be as slim as fast as possible. Because most of the people using it were conservationists that were organising to get together to do planting events and to do great work, we kind of figured that they would get real pissed off if they were trying to load a really complex site in the middle of nowhere looking for someone's phone number over rural 3G. So we sat down and figured out exactly what components we needed to design for and what we didn't. And as a result, the front end for the site is really tiny. This is one of my favourite websites. You type in a website and it tells you exactly how big the CSS for that site is, which is useful for Drupal because Drupal obviously has its own kind of CSS that it puts on there as well for status messages and maintenance node messages. So yeah, this is like something I'm probably a little bit too proud of. It's only 62 kilobytes. I would love for you guys to have a look and at some of your own sites and how they stack up. And if you've managed to make one that's smaller, which is as complex, please tweet me and tell me. I would love to have a look.
That's for a 4,000-page website.
Yes, thank you. Because, would you believe, Tumblr, a blogging platform, the CSS is nearly a fucking megabyte. How? 188 unique colours? Stupid. So, what's the point of all this? I reckon these tools mean that the designer-developer workflows are becoming closer together, which means that your final product is going to get closer to the original design. That means happy designer, happy developer, happy clients, happy users. I feel like the terminology for Flexbox and grids is way more self-explanatory than margins and floats and what we've been using to accomplish these things. It means at the end of the day, you can do more with just plain CSS, less having to rely on JavaScript and manipulating the DOM. And when you don't have to use as much time to write really weird CSS, you can spend more time focusing on the small details and getting a really polished site. So yeah, it just makes sense. If you're intimidated by any of these new things, I'd encourage you to have a look at the Mozilla documentation. They're really good, especially for grids, and they have a lot of like code pen examples. And if you want to learn even more, your local tech meetups are a great resource. I think I forgot to mention, I'm the organiser of the Wellington CSS meetup. If anyone's from Wellington, I'd love to have you along. I find them really good just to keep me inspired to try new things, because it can be intimidating. That's it. So thank you very much for having me. I think I've run out of time for questions, but it's my Twitter handle, or just come up and say hi. So thanks very much.